In a move that has sent shockwaves through the global community on the morning of April 2nd, 2026, President Donald Trump delivered a brutal and decisive message to Western allies currently standing on the brink of economic collapse due to energy shortages. Trump asserted that the United States no longer possesses any vital interests in the Strait of Hormuz and is prepared to withdraw its forces early, leaving the choke point to its fate without clearing it for international tankers. The declaration "Go get it yourself" is not merely a rhetorical flourish, it represents a landmark shift in geopolitical doctrine. America has officially ended its role as the free global policeman for international shipping lanes. Trump publicly lambasted nations such as the United Kingdom and France as passengers who enjoy the protection of the US military while refusing to participate in high-risk military operations. He mocked the fact that while the US performed the most difficult task of decapitating the Iranian regime and obliterating Tehran's nuclear capabilities, the allies stood on the sidelines and are now complaining about jet fuel shortages and financial chaos. Trump offered two ruthless choices to the world: either buy oil directly from the United States at market prices, where Washington boasts a massive surplus due to fracking, or these nations must build up some delayed courage, send their fleets into the Strait of Hormuz, and fight for the oil they depend on. This message reflects a cold, transactional pragmatism. Why should American lives and taxpayer dollars be risked to protect the economic lifeblood of nations unwilling to share the military burden? Trump asserted that the hard part is done, referring to the destruction of Iran's primary resistance capabilities. Now, if the world wants energy, it must learn to fight for it. This is a total collapse of the collective security system, where Washington no longer views the protection of global energy markets as its unilateral responsibility. The US has prepared for this isolation by securing resources in Venezuela and optimizing domestic production, transforming itself into an impenetrable energy fortress against Middle Eastern volatility. The profound rift between the United States and its Western allies stems not only from military disagreements, but from a total opposition in long-term energy strategies. While much of Europe and Australia were swept up in the global warming scare, leading to restrictions on domestic oil and gas development and bans on fracking technology, Donald Trump went in the opposite direction with the slogan "Drill, baby, drill." The result of this contrast is a grim reality. The United States is now a net fuel exporter, while allies like Australia must import 90% of their fuel needs, mostly from the volatile Middle East. This dependence turned allied economies into hostages of Iran the moment the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Economic experts suggest that the current oil famine in London or Paris is a direct consequence of woke energy policies. Trump mocked allies for essentially putting a noose around their own necks by abandoning energy self-sufficiency in favor of vague climate goals. Now, with their economies starving for oil, they look toward Washington for salvation. However, the US is no longer showing leniency. Trump is using America's energy independence as a shield to protect domestic voters from inflation, while simultaneously weaponizing it as a diplomatic tool to force allies into submission. This is considered one of the most consequential diplomatic decisions since the era of Ronald Reagan. The disparity in fuel security between the US and the rest of the West has created an unbridgeable chasm. America can afford to fight for its freedom and security without fear of economic collapse, whereas allies like the UK and Australia cannot. They are left with no choice but to face the reality. Either return to extreme fossil fuel extraction or accept being sidelined in a new world order led by the US. The crisis at Hormuz has exposed not just military weakness, but the total failure of unrealistic green energy policies in the face of brutal geopolitical events. The world's largest military alliance, NATO, is facing a historic divorce driven by accumulated resentment from Washington. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and President Trump have publicly questioned the very purpose of NATO after European allies denied the US access to military bases and airspace during the campaign to punish Iran. Rubio's remarks were scathing. Why are we spending trillions of dollars to station troops and protect a region that blocks our operations when the stakes are highest? This is no longer an empty threat. It is a fundamental shift in how the US views its mutual defense commitments. American resentment focuses on the fact that they have carried the majority of military costs for decades, yet when coordination was needed to destroy a state sponsor of terror like Iran, the Allies chose to stand aside to protect their own interests. The current US leadership views NATO as an obsolete entity, where European nations merely free ride on American power. Trump suggested that once the conflict in Iran concludes, the US will proceed with a full re-examination of the alliance's value. This could lead to a massive withdrawal of American forces from Germany, the UK, and other nations, leaving them to fend for themselves against threats from Russia or the Middle East. This fracture also reveals the rise of a new ideology in Washington: transactional pragmatism. The US will no longer protect any nation unless that nation proves its worth or provides a commensurate contribution. The hesitation of NATO countries to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz to share the fire with the US has become the final straw. If NATO cannot unify its actions in a vital energy war, then the meaning of a mutual defense treaty becomes worthless. The world is witnessing the end of the post-World War II collective security era, replaced by an order where the US acts solely on pure national interest and is willing to abandon old allies in chaos if they refuse to pay or fight alongside Washington. While Western powers argue over oil and alliance terms, the nation facing the most immediate threat of extinction is Ukraine. Situated at the bleeding edge of the East-West divide, Ukraine is entirely dependent on Western unity and military support to resist Russian aggression. However, the rift between the US and Europe over the Iran issue is pushing Kyiv into an extremely perilous position. If the US retreats into isolationism and NATO dissolves, the security umbrella keeping Ukraine alive could vanish overnight. The irony is that while capitals like London and Paris hesitate to send even a single ship to the Gulf to rescue their own oil flow, they are inadvertently sending a message of weakness to the Kremlin. Moscow is closely watching the indecision and declining courage of Western allies. If Britain or France lack the bravery to protect their own economic arteries at the Strait of Hormuz, then their willingness to sacrifice for democracy in Eastern Europe is nearly zero. Trump has warned that he is prepared to let the global economy starve to teach allies a lesson in self-reliance, and Ukraine may be the painful price Europe pays for its indecision. President Zelensky has warned of a severe missile deficit as Western resources are diverted toward the Middle East. The US shift toward its energy fortress and the seizure of Venezuela show that Washington is prioritizing its own survival over a war of attrition in Europe. For Ukraine, the war at Hormuz is not a distant conflict, but a tectonic shift threatening to destroy every security commitment they have relied upon. If Trump's New World Order is established based on energy transactions, then a nation without resources and devastated by war like Ukraine will have very few cards to play on this ruthless geopolitical chessboard. In summary, the events of April 2nd, 2026 have established an irreversible new geopolitical reality. The era of free American protection has officially ended. The world is entering a self-service order, where every nation must secure its own energy supply and military deterrence. Donald Trump has proven that national power in the 21st century lies not just in nuclear warheads, but in the capacity for energy, self-sufficiency, and the willingness to use unilateral force to protect domestic economic interests. The United States has built an unshakable position by securing massive resources in Venezuela and optimizing domestic shale production. This allows Washington to stand indifferently outside the crisis at the Strait of Hormuz, watching allies and rivals alike struggle in an energy famine. This is a brutal punishment aimed at the energy and diplomatic policies that Trump deems weak and erroneous from both previous administrations and Western allies. For nations like the UK, France, or Australia, the choice is grim. Either completely change their energy mindset and increase defense spending to clear their own shipping lanes, or accept economic collapse and become second-class nations entirely dependent on US supplies. The battle at Hormuz is no longer about saving the global oil market, but a final test of the courage and self-reliance of nations. Trump has played his hand and pushed the ball of responsibility back toward nations far too accustomed to free-riding on American strength. The New World Order will be shaped by those with the resources and courage to act, rather than those who simply hope for protection from a superpower that has chosen to retreat into its own fortress. America First has now become a ruthless geopolitical reality, forcing all of humanity to adapt or be crushed in the cycle of a systematically transactional era. If you want to stay updated with fast, accurate news and never miss important developments around the world, hit the subscribe button now.